Thanks everyone for joining MECC office hours. Scott, thanks for having the first question or suggestion. You want to verbalize it?
Sure. Thanks, Sid. Reading through this and taking the training, I thought there should be explicit reference made to informed decision in the context of a shared set of values. So we make reference to the shared set of values in the prerequisites for MECC, and we describe MECC externally. We refer to it as being driven from our values at GitLab, but the management philosophy itself barely talks about values and making decisions based on our core values. So I think there should be a section underneath informed decisions that those decisions should be made in the context of the organization's shared set of values to give guardrails to a diverse workforce and keep group cohesiveness that we need for distributed decision making.
Yeah, thanks for that. That makes a ton of sense. I think that MECC should be something that transcends GitLab. So I don't think you have to need to have the same set of values as GitLab.
Sure. But I guess I missed in reading through MECC, I missed making a decision based on whatever your core set of values are, right? And we say that prerequisite, you should have some, but we never say that you're explicitly say our decisions should be made in those contexts. So that's what
I think that's a great point. Like have values as a distributed framework for making decisions. That's certainly something we advocate for, and that should apply to other companies. So let's look into that. Thank you.
I'll add one other point, Scott. Thanks for the feedback. What we've attempted to do in the examples is make them operating principles. So an informed public by default. If you go to our values page and look at transparency, that's a way to practice transparency. But I agree that there could be more explicit callouts in connecting those two. I'll reemphasize Sid's point that we do want to at least be mindful of, I'll stop short of saying avoid, but be mindful of painting this picture externally that you have to adhere to GitLab's values for this to be relevant or useful to you. And also we want to make sure that it's not seen as an all or nothing proposition. It would be great if some other organizations find some value in some of the pages of MECC, even if it's even if it's not all directly applicable. But point taken, and we'll look into it. Thanks for the context and feedback.
Thank you.
Who wants to verbalize Seth his point?
Yeah, I can do that. So Seth, thanks for the question, and not on the call, so I'll verbalize for Seth. It feels like a low level of shame. Low level of shame is one of our operating principles within the values page. It feels like a low level of shame gets harder to have as the company scales. There are more coworkers and customers to impress. The quality of our software, videos, graphic content, communications, etc., keeps getting better and better because of the amount of resources each of them get and the grooming they go through. In that environment, it seems harder to show up with a low level of shame. Do you view scaling as a challenge to keeping a low level of shame?
I think it's an articulate point. I agree. It gets harder. People expect a higher uptime of GitLab.com today. People expect fewer show-stopping bugs. People expect a better designed website and a more beautiful looking website. A few things we can do to counter that. You mentioned kind of the grooming, or maybe call it iteration, that things go through. So there's a difference between kind of if you, on one hand, iteration is not like making a new draft, but there can be maybe a status that you apply to something where you say, hey, this is an alpha version of something, or this is something we're working on and it's not up to X level yet. If we make a change to our merge request functionality, it should be really good. because that's used a lot. If we make a change to our observability features, the bar is lower because they're not used as much yet. So one way to think about it is, as you have kind of more people on your website, yes, if you make a change to the homepage, there's more scrutiny. On the other hand, the pages that have less than 100 visitors a month, there are more of those pages in a big company than at a small company. So it's about making sure that you tune it to what the usage is. And I think as a company, we should get better at that. Like there's a big difference depending on how many people are visiting something, how many people are using something, how many people are doing a course, and we can allocate our effort and the bar that we have accordingly.
I would, what I found useful in this is just being explicit about it, saying from the top, hey, I'm going into this, not knowing everything. I'm attempting to operate with a low level of shame. And that relieves a lot of tension in the room when you just come out and say something like that. I'll also point out that a piece of evidence that you're not operating with a low level of shame is concealing work until it's perfect. And I think we can, even as we scale, I think we should still try to maintain that familiarity with the feeling of not concealing, sharing things early and often. Although the bar may get higher and higher, it gets that way because of smaller iterations along the way. I won't say it's not more difficult as we scale, but I do think there's a big burden on people managers to be explicit about operating with that and continuing to let people know that it's okay and encouraged to operate with that low level of shame.
Valerie, do you want to verbalize your point?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to call out that I love the clarification that we made to iteration. The MR is available in the agenda. Thank you for that. I think it's really important for us to remember that quality of what we deliver to users matters. So somewhat related to, I think, the previous agenda item, we have to find the appropriate balance between getting something out quickly while also still having it provide value to our users. Are there plans to expand on this in the future?
So thanks for that. And the change we made is we changed it from the smallest thing possible to the smallest thing viable and valuable. Like if you make a change, it has to be viable and valuable. Otherwise, it doesn't add anything. I do think that we should get better at making sure that GitLab is a better product. And the phrase I use for that is it should feel like a curated experience where someone cares about the experience. In the product, we have too many pop-ups, too many options, too many interruptions, too many things that distract and take away from the experience. And maybe someone can link the curated experience doc. At the same time, we want to make sure that we go really fast in areas that have little usage, and little usage will be things that are new. If we're adding APM functionality like metrics and logs, that should go really fast and the bar is lower on execution. On the other hand, if I'm looking at a merge request, like I expect that updates automatically and things like that, because that's heavily used functionality. So we should be very hesitant to apply the same bar to everything the company does. If you look at the company, we spend too much time on the user's experience of new functionality and too little time of the user's experience of heavily used parts of the application. So it's really important to make that distinction. And yeah, we now have parts of GitLab that are very heavily used. We didn't have that in the past, so we didn't have to account for that. Now we have that. We need to do that. It's a great thing, but it only means that there's more areas as we see GitLab as a kind of a big sphere with something in the center. It means that there's more surface area around it that is now lightly used. We want more usage, and we want to add more things to it. And that goes not just for the product, it goes for our website, our courses, the content we put out, and everything else. Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you, Sid. As I went through the training, I found it really helpful just to kind of remind myself of what we stand on, and one of the some of the reasons I joined GitLab. And one of the questions that came out of it for me was, just as the company has grown and we seek for more community contributions and decisions that impact the user interface, they occur more frequently. I'm curious what your thoughts are on how we can increase and maintain user experience and design consistency when changes that impact the UI and UX can come from so many places.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's a bit repetitive, but I'll repeat it and hopefully it adds something. I think it's really important that UI, UX wise, we're proactive in that we fix things, we make things better that are heavily used, even if we're maybe not adding functionality to that part of the application at the moment. So I could see a contribution coming in and landing in the product, and the UI UX improving later, not at the same time, but that improvement being made later. Right now, I think a lot of the time of UI UX is scheduled only when kind of the product manager decides that there's a feature coming there or something like that. And while that it is also many times an appropriate time to have a look at things, most of the features we're adding are on the surface of the product, these lightly used things where we're adding a ton of features. And it's so important to improve kind of the core user experience, the things that are very heavily used. Any other takes from anyone?
I have a quick comment. So when we're talking about adding new features, we're often adding new features to heavily populated areas. How do you suggest we balance the new feature that isn't heavily used in the context of a very heavily used page or view?
And balance in what way?
So if you add a new feature to a heavily used area of our product, it can distract from the main purpose of that view. I think oftentimes we think more about, I need to add this feature in. We know that it's going to be of value to our users, so let's get it in. But it could take away from maybe the premise or the priority of another persona within that same view.
Yep, I think you're spot on, and there's no easy answers there. I do feel in general, we've gone kind of as a product from phase 1 to phase 2, naive simplicity to sophisticated complexity. But we need to go one level further, which is sophisticated simplicity. And that's going to take some hard decisions, including deprecating functionality that people contributed in the past, and things like that. And those are very tough things. But hopefully we can come with data on like where people click and what people use in order to do that. Joe.
Before I jump in, I just want to say that the level up content and the way that the information was curated was really well done. So kudos to you. Question here is there's reference to the term workplace OS, which is defined as an organizational framework. Question here is MECC a subcategory of workplace OS? And if so, what do the future iterations of workplace OS look like?
Yeah, Joe, thanks for that. We are currently working with a category design agency to more formally figure out what this should look like. The current view of this is that Workplace OS is going to be, let's call it an umbrella, where certain modules of building a modern workplace can live under. MECC being one of those, what we've built within All Remote being maybe an infrastructure component of those. That may change depending on what they find from a competitive audit. But as of now, that's what we're hoping to build. And so we're working on more of an umbrella where MECC and All Remote are what we currently have, but I feel like we can scale it. And there's some other elements that will certainly be useful to building a modern workplace that we want a home for. So I'm trying to build the home for it now, and then fill it as we go. I do want to take this opportunity to point out, when I say modern workplace, it's a very intentional term. We want to speak to every workplace, not just fully remote workplaces, not just hybrid workplaces. Sid has long pointed out that much of what we do, 90+% of it, are just great business practices that we had to do earlier and with more intentionality because All Remote forced us to do that. And this is a great opportunity as much of the world figures out what their physical strategy is, fully co-located, some form of hybrid, All Remote. We can still meet them where they are. And we are attempting to share as much of this through a, we'll call it, location agnostic lens as possible.
Thanks, Darren. And to indicate how much of a work in progress this is, I think we're working with a brand agency, but my current opinion is that we should not try to bring two words into the world. I think one is hard enough. I don't see MECC as part of being remote. I think only very few companies are going to be all remote in the foreseeable future, especially among our customers. A lot aren't. So I don't want to turn companies off from the great things we have to add by indicating that being all remote is part of that. And a third option on the table for naming this instead of MECC or Workplace OS would be decision discipline. And feel free to chime in the doc what resonates, including other suggestions, because I feel like we haven't settled on the naming yet. Brian.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. This is actually, I think, a great follow-up to the question, or to the previous question, and to Darren's explanation of sort of the sort of architecture, conceptual architecture under which this lives. The last several years have seen a real an uptick in the global conversation about the ways that open principles, like the ones that animate GitLab's operating principles and practices, are impacting organizational culture and design, regardless of industry, regardless of organizational structure, in a sort of vertical agnostic way, if you will. So I'm wondering, to what extent the MECC team and others have, thought about how we plug into that conversation, how we become part of that global project to really better understand those connections and what we contribute and how we contribute. For example, are we going to open source our materials? Do we offer openly licensed training modules? Do we create definitions that others can fork and modify and set, et cetera? So just curious how we play in the space that's already kind of ongoing.
Yeah, I'll take a first step, and then Jessica. I think, first of all, the materials we have are Creative Commons by attribution, so they're already open source in that regard. I think transparency is super important. It's important when getting the right data to make decisions, the first part of MECC. I do think that just talking about transparency doesn't talk about making decisions fast and taking many of them. And you see a lot of organizations that only have transparency and openness, actually they slow down. They become very similar to consensus-based organizations. They're not able to make fast decisions. They're not able to make many of them. So I do think that openness is only one part of it. And if you only have openness, you are likely to experience some problems in the other parts of MECC. Jessica.
Yeah, so first of all, I'll say, Brian, you're relatively new to GitLab, I believe. You're a huge part of the open organization team and community. So shout out to you for all of the work that you do there. I'm a big fan. I do believe that openness is something that drives things forward. And I think it's very valuable. How that works with, GitLab's plans and model, that's really a decision that is out of my hands to make. But I will say that I personally believe that there's value in being transparent, in sharing as much openly as possible, and in sharing lessons and learnings with other organizations. And that's sort of the goal. Where it ends up falling on that, I can't say for sure, but certainly influenced by your work with open organization.
Thanks. Will?
Hi, yes, thank you so much for having this conversation and introducing this. To me, it just stood out as reminded me of Speed of Trust by Stephen Covey. And I was wondering if there was any connection there, whether intended or not, or maybe it's just a happy coincidence.
It's a happy coincidence. And I see it's new for Darren too. So I think Darren will check it out. And Darren, please keep me and Jessica abreast of what you find. I do think maybe not knowing the materials, maybe it is a bit like openness, that it's you need not just trust. I frequently hear people say, oh, GitLab is a very trusting organization. And I think we are working in a high trust environment, but there's also a lot of accountability at GitLab. So I think that the two kind of come hand in hand. And if you only do trust, you'll lose on the other parts. If you only do accountability, you need all of them. And I think that's what we're trying to do with MECC. Both have decisions out in the open and the ability to make them fast. Both making many decisions and being able to execute on them. And I think there's a lot of powerful oversimplifications that only show one side. Now, I think MECC is still a powerful oversimplification. There's even more nuance to it, but at least hopefully we add a little bit more than some of the other frameworks without ever having seen Speed of Trust. And maybe it's a lot more balanced than I give it credit for right now.
That's great. Thank you.
Any other questions? Feel free to verbalize without adding to the doc. Well, this was really great. And thanks everyone for doing certifications. We've seen hundreds of certifications already. Thanks for doing that. And looking forward to merge requests, because I'm sure we got some things wrong. I'm sure some examples could be better. So if you have a better example, please feel free to ask us to change it out or send a merge request. Looking forward to making the materials better together. Thank you so much.